discussing the future of professions in these times of crisis, or even the demise of professions. What a way to celebrate your 50th anniversary as a business school. RSM is doing that as we speak. Welcome to the first in a series of lectures as part of the Open Lecture series at RSM. And to begin with the future of professions, I'll introduce the speakers in more detail, but first of all, welcome to all of you participants. Participants, as shown here on the infographic, half of you, roughly speaking, are connected to RSM in one way or another. The other half is about to get connected through this event, aren't you? And then we have several top industries represented, from education to consulting to IT. All of you are working in certain professions, aren't you? We'll hear in more detail from our first speaker, but for now, please make sure, if you want to interact with the speakers, to register, so you can send in questions and vote on the polls that they have prepared for you. For now, a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Rick van der Klei. I'll be your moderator, but you may have noticed by now. I will introduce the first speaker for tonight. Clearly, he would have voted that he has a relation to RSM. He used to be a managing consultant back in the days at McKinsey. Will that be a profession or not? We'll hear from him in more detail. He is a professor of corporate strategy, organization and governance. And on top of that, he has done actual research into professional services quite extensively. So we are glad to be hosted by the celebrator of the Jubilee, the Dean of RSM, Professor Ansgar Richter.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's great to be here this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to this evening. Yeah.
And you have an opening question for us as participants, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely. As we are beginning this evening, I was just interested in getting to know the audience and asking the question, if your son or your daughter was about to study, say, law or accountancy or something along those lines, what kind of skills or competencies would you be worried that they would not be getting?
That they would not be getting?
That they would not be getting, absolutely. So if you can provide us with your answers, we'll come back to that in the course of this evening. Good. I wanted to talk a little bit about the demise of the professions. That's what the title of my talk is. And that title is certainly provocative, and I expect to get a call from the rector or the president of this university, because if the title was really true, I think we at Erasmus University would have a real problem, right? This university is built around the classical professions. This is where you study medicine, where you study psychology, law, accountancy, all those kind of topic areas. I also think that I would have a personal problem because, in fact, my wife is a doctor and my daughter has just taken that decision and she is studying law as well. And as Rick has said, I have also worked as a management consultant, and that's not really a profession in the true sense of the word, but I'm going to come back to that. I would call it a semi-profession. But also, if you look at the pure statistics, I think you will see that in some sense the title is provocative because the professional service market is a huge market, absolutely huge. I have some statistics for you here, and this is only about the business-to-business professional services, and they account for about 5.7 trillion already in 2018, according to Business Wire, which is a market research firm, and there is growth in this sector as well, right? So for all intents and purposes, professional services are a huge part of the economy, and if you add the business to consumer type of professional services such as medicine and potentially psychology and other areas, then that sector is obviously even bigger, right? So in some sense you could say we have the answer. I'm wrong here with this argument that there is a demise of the professions. Having said that, my central argument for this evening is that there is some fundamental change going on in the professions, and I believe that professions in future will not look like anything as they do look now, right? So that is my basic argument that I would like to elaborate on this. So let me back up a little bit and talk about the question what actually professions are and where they come from. And how have they come to be what we see as the professions today. Now, you know, the professions are really a result of the 19th century. They developed in the late part of the Industrial Revolution. So if you look here at this slide, you know, this is kind of an argument developed by you know, Harold Perkin, an historian. What you will see is that the professions emerged in the late part or in the second half of the 19th century, obviously building on earlier developments. Some professions have been around for a long period of time, such as medicine, but at the same time with certain developments, such as the growth in the population, industrialization, the rise of big corporations, but also the emergence of welfare system in societies, then you know, something really fundamental happens and the main factors of production began to change. Right? Whereas in the Industrial Revolution, labor and capital were the two fundamental sources of production. With the rise in professional society, it became knowledge and human expertise, right? And that became, if you will, the hallmark of the professions. So what are the professions really? They are built around bodies of knowledge. And this knowledge has certain characteristics. It's extensive. In order to really master a profession, you have to study for a long period of time and acquire a lot of professional knowledge. It's also diverse, so there are different facets to that knowledge that you need to acquire, right? And the professions really are the bodies, if you will, of groups of people that organize the knowledge in their particular area of expertise. So I'll show you some basic characteristics. I already mentioned the particular sets of knowledge and skills as the hallmark of these professions. This knowledge and skills, that creates scarcity because this knowledge is such extensive that it can't be shared by everyone, right? At the same time, within the professional groups, there is extensive regulation from within, self-regulations. So in other words, professional bodies create barriers to entry for others. Not everyone can call themselves a professional, at least in those classical professions, right? And also, these professional bodies oftentimes develop a code of conduct or some certain behavioral expectations that you need to adhere to in order to be able to count yourself as a professional, right? So the most classical professions have developed around the most reasonably well-defined bodies of knowledge, and you see this most classically in medicine, law, and accounting. These are probably the three most classical professions that you can think of. You can see a lot of examples of that. For example, if you're a doctor in England, you're only allowed to practice medicine if you are registered with the General Medical Council, one of these professional bodies. And in most American jurisdictions, lawyers can only sit the bar exam if they've studied at a law school that is accredited by the American Bar Association. Except in California, there it is different. And in the Netherlands, auditing licensing certificates are issued by the NBA. Now, you might think that's the National Basketball Association, but really what I mean here is the Nederlandse Beroepsorganisatie van Accountants. So these professions are really characterized by really strong behavioral and moral codes that extend to the members of this profession, right? And this oversight from within the professional bodies that keeps the professions free from external oversights and assures control from within. Now, around these classical professions that I've mentioned, medicine, accounting and auditing and law, there are a lot of other professions that have emerged as well that share many, but not necessarily all of the characteristics of the classical professions. For example, think of architects or surveyors or actuaries and even management consultants, although with respect to that particular group, and I mentioned it earlier, one big problem is that the body of knowledge that serves as a basis for management consulting is so ill-defined, it's so diverse, and there are no industry bodies that effectively control consultants and that define barriers to entry. Anyone can call themselves a consultant, really. And therefore, it is often the firms themselves that serve as a substitute for the industry bodies, right? And then, of course, we have to be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of other service-based activities that attach the label professional to themselves. So what we see here is an almost dialectic development. With the rise and the success of the professions, a lot of semi-professions have merged, and that has endangered the very success on which the professional services are, or at least were, based in the past. For example, many accounting firms are moving with very happy regularity into management consulting until there is a tightening of rules and regulations from the outside that forces them to refocus for the sake of greater independence. And a few years afterwards, the same cycle begins again. What we also see, and this gets us really a little closer to the question of what the future holds, is the rise of new and mixed forms of professional expertise. For example, the major accounting and auditing firms have moved strongly into providing legal services as well. Or think about the rise of forensic accounting, or of firms that blend regulatory law, industry economics, and data analysis. Firms such as the Berkeley Research Group, for example. However, the development that will clearly have the most massive effect on the future of professional services is the rise of data analytics, artificial intelligence, and machine learning, and of autonomous systems. This development is, of course, not entirely new either. Over the last 40 years, the rise of information technology has already had a significant impact on the professions. For example, expert systems in law go back to the 1980s already, right? And if you want to read an interesting book about this, I really recommend you this book by Ziskand and Ziskand about the future of the profession. It's really provocative read. However, I don't agree with all of their arguments that they are putting forward. More recently, legal tech is providing new tools that restructure the relationship between legal service providers and their clients. For example, in the form of legal review and reporting procedures, or automated compliance rules, and many others. Or think about medical robotics. I have a few examples here. You see here the Da Vinci surgery system, or an automated biopsy system here, and some other devices that I'm going to come to later, right? And that obviously has a massive effect on the nature of medicine. Or think about the use of predictive analytics that is giving new opportunities for the consulting firms that I was mentioning earlier. And obviously that last example also shows some of the problems associated with this development. So I don't know whether you remember this, but it's only about 2 years ago that Cambridge Analytica went bust after a huge scandal. They used data from millions of Facebook profiles in order to develop micro-targeting strategies to influence the American elections in 2016. And who knows what's going to happen in this year's election. So these examples show that new technologies are already affecting professional services today, and in a very big way. Nevertheless, it's probably fair to say that so far, by and large, IT has supported the professions and opened new opportunities to them. It's been primarily a supply-side phenomenon. And you could even argue that these developments have reinforced or widened the power distance between professional service providers on the one hand and buyers on the other hand. However, when these new technologies affect the demand side on a bigger scale, it is quite imaginable that a lot of the activities currently carried out by human professionals may become obsolete. For example, I have on this slide here also some wearable gadgets, including the new iWatch 6 here, that have functions such as an ECG or the measurement of blood oxygen levels. And there are other devices here as well that can do similar things. And if the data generated by these devices is paired with other information about us, for example, our location and other behavioral information, we could actually receive machine-generated, personalized medical advice in future. And that may well reduce the need to go to a doctor's practice. And so Ziskand and Ziskand, the authors that I just mentioned, they argue that there's hardly any human competence that, if considered in isolation, could not be carried out by IT, at least in principle, and potentially better than we can do as human beings. So that's their argument. So I do believe that the professions, as we know them, will undergo very massive change to the point of being unrecognizable from our point of view today. Nevertheless, I think there is a lot of reason for optimism. And I believe that the predictions of large-scale professional unemployment are widely exaggerated. First, I think we should recognize that in the transition phase, before particular occupations disappear, demand for these very occupations is oftentimes increasing. So take the example, not from the professions, not from the classical professions, but truck drivers. There are about 3.5 million truck drivers in the US. And that makes it one of the largest occupations in the United States. And there's a big debate currently going on about potential mass unemployment among those truck drivers, as we have in future potentially autonomous vehicles or the delivery of goods by drones. So some of these technologies are already available. And nevertheless, we are facing a shortage of truck drivers at the moment. Similarly, we should note that there were already predictions of technologically induced mass unemployment in the 1980s and 1990s, for example, by Jeremy Rifkin in his book, The End of Work. But these predictions have proven to be wrong. And I believe that humans actually do have some competencies that, at least so far, computers and AI systems cannot easily match. So let me outline some of these competencies. First of all, the ability to interpret. That is, the ability to make sense of a particular situation in a holistic fashion that takes into account social, economic, psychological, cultural, or other dimensions, for example, of legal or medical problems. Then secondly, the ability to empathize and to be passionate about something. Susskind and Susskind are using an example, and I think they are correct in this, that computers can be creative. For example, it's probably not so far off that computers can create art or music. So that is a fundamental transformation. But what I cannot easily imagine is a situation where the computer actually loves the music that it creates. And I think that is a quality that humans actually have. And thirdly, the ability to cope with considerable ambiguity or versatility, that is, the ability to draw on seemingly disparate sources of expertise and to adapt to new situations. And this versatility is particularly important, I believe. So if you look at the professions for which the highest growth is expected in the future, and I am not entirely sure why the next slide is not coming up here, but you will see that there are a lot of occupations that involve solid, but maybe not extreme levels of professional expertise, but that expertise will have to be combined with the ability to apply, to involve different pieces of knowledge, and even a level of dexterity at the same time. Things such as occupational therapists, for example, which is a high-growth occupation. So how exactly the new professions will look, we don't really know. And I don't want to gaze into a crystal ball. Nevertheless, I believe that the general points I've made have lots of implications for students and for the providers of education, for example, universities and business schools. For example, in that we need a much greater emphasis needed on lifelong learning. The exact competencies that will be needed in the future in tomorrow's jobs cannot be fully anticipated ex ante. Learning will need to be distributed over people's lifetimes. Also, initial study in particular should be far more interdisciplinary in nature than often it is today. The really interesting questions are at the interfaces between different fields of expertise. At RSM and more broadly at Erasmus University, we are doing this already, or at least we have started to do this. For example, we offer an undergraduate program in Recht and Bedrijfskunde. And together with Erasmus Medical Center, we'll soon be introducing a new specialization in medical business innovation in our master's degree. And more interdisciplinary programs are yet to come. But just think about the interfaces, for example, between accounting and finance or marketing on the one hand, and digital technologies on the other hand. That's an extremely rich field. Finally, in terms of human competency, the ability to interpret and to communicate persuasively and to move from insight into action, these are also unique competencies. At a time when political leaders in many countries blatantly flout the rule of law, who could argue that legal expertise becomes unimportant? But what's missing here is not so much the expertise as such, but the ability and the willingness to draw the right consequences, to communicate those consequences, and to design approaches for changing human behaviors for the better, to make this insight, this expertise personal. This also includes the ability to interpret and ask the relevant questions, to critique and to identify the limits of a given answer. Overall, I believe that the notion of the professions that are organized around a particular body of knowledge will in the long run become pretty obsolete. However, professional skills that involve using knowledge from diverse sources, interpreting them and turning them into actionable insight, that will still remain relevant. Thank you very much for your attention so far. I hope that you found my thoughts provocative and insightful, and I look forward to the interaction later on.
Thank you very much, Professor Richter. And to start with, a practitioner's point of view, or more specifically, an RSM alumnus. He is a 1999 graduate of business administration here, and currently he is proudly fulfilling the semi-profession of management consultant. First, he worked at EY in South Africa and then for Bain. He just returned from Johannesburg, where he led Bain's technology, digital and analytics practices. And currently he is a partner of Bain Amsterdam. So he's both a hiring manager and an alumnus here. Barry Diepeveen.
Thank you very much, Rick. And Ansgar, thank you very much for a very, very interesting talk. It has sparked a lot of interesting thoughts, at the very least in my mind. Thank you also to the broader RSM community for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you tonight. I was thinking, as I prepared for this particular talk, about what is actually going on if you're in the profession, or if, as Ansgar is putting it rightfully so, in the semi-profession of management consultant. And I think a lot of things are coming our ways. We've most probably heard about VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity that is coming towards us through multiple fronts. And I thought, what are the layers of complexity that is coming our way and that we need to deal with in terms of putting a North Star out? Where do we focus on if we want to succeed going forward? I see three key themes playing out. The one is where I think Ansgar has just referred to. What are the breakthrough technologies? What are the advances in data, in analytics, in AI, but also fundamental cloud technologies that we see coming our way and will most probably put our industry upside down? But I also think we need to take into account macroeconomic developments. And I foresee a collision of multiple forces, demographics that will play out, but also inequality that I think will have an impact on the economic reality that we will fulfill our profession in. And then at the same time, if we were to have this talk 12 months ago, I don't think we would talk about a new normal, a world where we need to recover and retool after a post-COVID-19 new reality. So I think these three dynamics will play out if you're in the world of professions. And I thought we'll share a couple of thoughts that I have around how to prepare for this. And there is bad news, and that is around the complexity, but I think there's also good news in terms of the opportunity that lie ahead. What I'll do through this presentation is just touch upon these three elements very, very briefly, and then go into what I see as a mindset and a certain set of skills that I think will be able to give us a platform to further successfully develop the industry of professions. The first one is really around the speed of change. And I've had a lot of questions from many of you in the audience leading up to this talk around, do we need in absolute terms to invest ourselves and our time into fundamental technologies? And my answer is clearly yes. If you want to be successful in any of the professions, you cannot deny, you cannot decline the developments that are happening in the space of technology enablement. I've just put a couple of quotes in here. There was a question from analysts to the CEO of Time Warner at the time, is Netflix a threat? This was 2010, the first initial stages of the Netflix development. Is the Albanian army going to take over the world, was the answer in the response. And 50% of the analysts thought that's a logical, that's a good answer to one of the challenges from my fellow analysts. Now in hindsight we can see how quickly technology has picked up. And most probably, if I look at the ages of some of the folks in the audience, I don't think you would even think in a world without Netflix being the reality. It also comes with elements and of examples where AI will give us better French fries. The AI technology, not only just in the generalist sense of the word, but if you see the developments that have taken place in that space are enormous. So my first message of tonight is you cannot just deny the world of technology. Embrace it. I've just put out a couple of themes that Gartner, an analyst company around technology trends, has put out for the 2020 trends of the future. New technology architecture that any organization, whether it's in the public or in the private domain, needs to work with. If speed is so important, how do you decompose architectures of companies and how do you embrace that change? Do we really still third parties to trust and the trust value chain, or will we allow algorithmic trusts to really take over that specific roles and take over the roles of these third parties? Then hardware, technically speaking, around what we will see in beyond silicon, silicon that powers a lot of the world's new technologies and innovations. The move, the trends that you'll see there in even further reducing the size that will allow you to drive far bigger compute power into the world. And then AI, a lot of talk is about AI and what it can do to our profession. And I do see that as a massive development. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Digital twins, if you see the technologies that will happen to not only just look at a digital version of myself, but also digital versions of corporate and some of the manufacturing environments out there. So grounding that in a good fundamental understanding, I think is incredibly important to not only just survive the trends of technology, but thrive through these in times to come. Ginny Rometty, ex-CEO of IBM, said 10% of the jobs could disappear, but 100% will change. Now, whether the 10% is progressive, conservative, my point here is that I think we need to be ready for the change that will come. And I think it's the mindset that will help you prosper. But then work in a world where the collision of forces will result in a major macroeconomic transformation. I see a couple of massive forces collide, and they will set the economic scene into a different reality. Demographics, the advancements in technology that we've just talked about, and inequality. The majority of the world's workforce is aging rapidly, and that will have an impact on the demand side of the growth. And the same will happen with the automation. Because if automation will potentially eliminate significant portions of the workforce, that will immediately have an impact on the demand side of that value chain. And then although automation will push the output initially, you will be ahead of the demand potential and as such have a tension on the growth of the future. And I am significantly worried about the inequality, both on income and in wealth, because that ultimately will limit growth of effective demand. And that will be driving us into a dynamic that I think we need to be ready for over the next 10 to 20 years. And that's that second layer of complexity that we need to think about. So it's not just the technology advancements, it's also working in a world of economic change. And there, the ability to adapt to change is what Stephen Hawking was referring to when he refers to intelligence. And I very much agree with that fundamental principle. And then still you're not there because we are recovering from a COVID world. And if you're in parts of Europe where you'll see spikes come back up, we might not even be ready to retool for the future, and we might still be in a recovery phase. I've looked at that world and I've come up with a couple of themes that I think as professionals we need to deal with over and above the elements that we've just talked about. Simplicity. Can we fundamentally simplify our profession and some of the processes to underpin this? Automation and digitization. I think we've touched upon that a couple of times now. Incredibly important to fully embrace that and understand the impact on our roles. Modern workforce. Have we not all learned through virtual meetings, working remotely? That could be actually pretty productive. But at the same time, if that sustains over time, do we start to miss elements of the interpersonal connect? Visibility, accountability, a great focus on end-to-end visibility and enhance the accountability that people will take and organizations will take. And I think the fifth theme for myself that almost summarizes some of these elements is operational resilience. If we've seen so much change just in the last 12 months globally, politically, economically, and the rest, I think we need to understand that that's something that we need to be ready for. So if I come to the end of what I would refer to, if I can have the next slide on the page. I'll just work through some of the technical challenges to move me to the next page, to share my views around what I think we could do in terms of positioning ourselves as professionals in that world of massive complexity and ambiguity. Because the key point for me is not so much on the key technical elements of what we need to embrace, but about the mindset. And if I look back at my two children that are 9 and 10, I do believe that they will be faced with a far more complex situation than I was when I grew up. At the same time, there's far greater opportunities. And as such, I think the mindset of adapting and constantly learning the new is important as we move forward in the professions. I'll also see that as a provocative discussion. Yeah, thank you very much for that. I'll just skip yeah, thank you very much for the question. I was asking if in all of these changes that we see in front of us, if you can log in and you'll help me with answering this question. I said, if you were to have €100 to spend on your own learning, how would you divide it over the 3 categories that we discussed earlier? Technology advances, the collision of the forces economically, or the retooling post a COVID world. So maybe if you can go online, then if you can give me a division of money where you would invest in the terms of these 3 categories, I think that would be incredibly insightful if we move to the chat a little bit later. But let me conclude with a couple of thoughts. In the world where there's so much complexity, I think as professionals, we need to start seeing ourselves as entrepreneurs. As entrepreneurs, you do not have all the answers. But without having all the answers, we need to balance the risk and the return and then set a direction on where we want to be as a professional. And then balance the focused learning with to adapt on the next waves that will come. And then without losing sight of the change management and the people engagement that is key going forward. You could argue with so much change, it goes back to the depth of the learning. But keeping the views open to constantly engage with a broader force is incredibly important. And train your judgment. As Ansgar had said in his talk, it's incredibly important to add that perspective to these elements. A couple of final thoughts. The profession, in my mind, will continue to bring judgment, interpretation, and perspective. That's what it's there for. And I do believe that next generation professionals, like you, and unlike myself at my age, encounter a significant more complex and layered situation than I've ever had in my professional career. And I think unpacking that and understanding where you need to focus on is incredibly important. So whereas business schools need to support the professional with traditional technical skills, they also need to do that with new skills to understand how to set priorities and adapt. And that sentence in italic, to me, is most important of what I've learned in the almost 20 years in the industry. I think your antennas for the new are actually becoming more important than what you have just learned. So adapting to a next generation situation is becoming more important to just leverage what you've just learned. As I spent a lot of years in South Africa and I've just moved back, I couldn't leave without putting a quote of Mandela in there. And it does summarize for me where I think we are as professionals. I never lose. I either win, which is great, or learn. And in that learning is the next element. I said to you as a closing thought that I think the profession adds judgment, but it doesn't come free. You've most probably seen that example. You can't just follow what automation and new technology will tell you. The woman's GPS told her to drive in a lake and she listened. So if you want to be a good professional, you can't just rely on the technology. Embrace the technology and add your interpretation to it. It's interesting to see, Rick, a couple of answers that we have received. I think technology advances scores very high. So let me bring that back to Rick and in the discussion now. Thank you very much for the attention and thanks again to the RSM for having me.
Thank you very much, Barry Diepeveen, for outlining your thoughts on the future of professions and more specifically for your ability to adapt to the change that happened during your talk.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, there was a slight technical glitch, as my sons would call it. Yeah.
Yeah, it looked as if you asked the team to have this glitch so that you could walk the talk.
That was not completely the case. Yeah,
not really,
yeah,
but it was an example of intelligence.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Then it's a human skill that you just showed there. And previously we asked for skills that are needed to survive the future, so to say, right, Ansgar?
Well, in particular in the professions, right? What particular skills will be needed in the future so that we should embed them in our studies, for example, if you do law, accounting, or any of the other professions and the training towards that, right? So I'm interested to see the results.
To see the results on the thought experiment of putting yourself in the shoes of your 18-year-old child deciding to study either law or accountancy. Yeah. What is coming up? We see a couple of skills that are needed according to our participants.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I see a big variety, certainly, but I kind of expected the computer science and the data analytics and programming even, the more technical skills, and I think you talked about that in your talk as well. But I see, interestingly, also compassion there, and the social skills and soft skills, leadership skills, the right mindset. So much more kind of softer skills, and I think that's true. That these are important, right? I mean, what I try to call, the interpretive skills as well, and I think they will, remain important, and also the ability to communicate. I think that is something that is deeply human and that will be needed in the future,
as we are doing here. And what would you add to the answers given, the skills needed according to you?
maybe I would add also the moral skills as well. You know, I don't know whether I should be talking about skills, but you know, I think you
also have a background in philosophy
judgment,
yourself.
right?
What do you mean by moral skills?
Well, the ability to make a good judgment, you know, of a particular situation, to distinguish also the right from the wrong, right? In complex, in a very volatile situation, certainly. But that's what I would mean by the moral skills as well.
And I would definitely agree with that, because if you look at the future of profession, it is ensuring that you can take into account all of these elements in applying judgment. So I think one of the key things that the professional of the future, of tomorrow, really needs to embrace is to have this broad view and being able to take into account all elements that matter in the given situation or complexity.
Yeah, that's what you're looking for as a hiring manager?
Correct. Yes, that is.
How do you assess that?
I think it's being shown on the skill sets required, because I am a very big fan of assessing both elements. There are deep technical skills that you could assess and test for. But in all honesty, they, for me, are not the make or break. The make or break is managing that in combination with what you refer to as the softer. But I would actually argue they are the more tougher ones to demonstrate. But these skill sets...
Yeah, soft, not in the sense of easy.
Exactly. So, and we often refer to as the people-oriented skills as the softer ones. But applying that judgment is where you'll really make a good decision versus a worse decision. So I think that skill set is something that you need to apply through interpersonal skills. So both the person that wants to go into a new environment as well as what you refer to as hiring manager, both need to apply these skills within themselves.
Yeah, and as an academic and also as a trainer of the new generation of maybe managing consultants, how do you get those people to get those skills through their studies? Because that's what parents will wonder when they send their kids to RSM, right?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether we have found the Holy Grail at RSM in this respect, but we do a number of things that I do find important. So we do integrate leadership training and personality development in all our programs.
How does that happen?
You know, for example, through an approach that we call goal setting as well, you know, where we ask our students, starting with the undergrad programs, to actually set goals for themselves, define what it is that they want, right? We have, you know, something that is the I Will campaign, or the I Will program as well. I've had that for quite a number of years now, where we invite students, but also alumni, you know, participants in our executive education program, whatever, right? All the stakeholders that come to RSM, and of course ourselves, our own academics, to actually define an I Will statement, right? What is it that they will want to achieve, right?
Yeah, in relation to RSM.
No, in their
it's not necessarily a marriage statement.
No, it's not
yes,
a marriage
I will.
statement, right? I mean, no one is married to RSM or any other university
organization for that matter.
Could you give a good example of how a sentence would sound like? Yes, yeah, I will.
My personal I will statement is I will make a positive difference, right? That's, you know, you can find this on my business card. If you walk around through our facilities, you'll find a lot of posters where people have actually posted their I will statements. You can see this on the internet, obviously, as well. And I find it inspiring to look into people's faces on these photos that are posted together with the I will statement, and actually read what it is that they will want to achieve.
Yeah. And I really think that's an incredibly important remark that you've just made, because professionally what I see in working with my clients is that you cannot know the future through all of these waves. But having a I will statement for an individual, a team or an organization helps you, guide you through that path. And then I think when you have that North Star, that I will statement, you will be able to deal with all the dynamics that will play out in what I would refer to as the waves of change as they will come more and more quicker. So I think an ambition, a vision, if you will, at multiple levels is incredibly important, because then adapting yourself towards all the external factors that will come your way, I think is an incredibly successful way of dealing with that change.
Yeah, before we get a couple of questions from the audience, one question I would like to ask to both of you: what did you like about the other man's talk? Who first?
I'm very happy to go first. I think your talk was very inspirational. I think it was very impressive. The one thing that really sticks out for me is your point around the initial divergence, if you will, if it's only on the supply side, the new technology and the innovations there. But when demand really picks up on this and also goes, and I see that with my clients, there's a far more mature behavior in terms of how to deal with professions in that regard. I think then you'll start to notice the real fundamental shifts that we will see in the industry. So that's the one thing that really stuck out for me in terms of the overall discussion.
Yes,
yeah.
and vice versa.
Yeah, I'd like to mention two things that struck me. I mean, one actually had very little to do, in a sense, with the profession specifically, but you mentioned the notion of inequality. And I think that is one of the key challenges of our time, and I'm deeply worried about the rise in inequality, in income, in life expectations, in wealth, and so on. And I think we have a real responsibility to help democratize technology as well, right, in order to make it accessible and not to be overruled by technology, but use it for good in a sense. So that's one thing. The other thing that I found important, specifically with respect to the professions, is that you also use the notion of entrepreneurship there. And in a way, that sounds almost contradictory, because if you think about the professions, and I talked a little bit about that, they're actually quite conservative in many respects.
They're not that entrepreneurial.
And they're not that entrepreneurial, at least by origin. And I think, that's where the future of the professions is. If there's a future to professions, we need to innovate them, right?
Yeah. And so I'm very much aligned to the entrepreneurship is, I think, important as a mindset. I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out of their current organizations to become an entrepreneur. Within your organization, understanding how you deal with not having all the answers and still making a couple of calls, I think is incredibly important. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All that being said and done, clearly your approaches complement one another. How do they collide? Is there anything, because Ansgar was very clear about his defense, so to say, of the profession, and then Barry was clear about what skills are needed in order to have these professions being successful? How could your perspectives collide? Is there anything that made you wonder, that you want to raise questions to the other?
I think one thing that is questionable still, or is a question that still sticks in my mind, and it is not related specifically to your talk or to my talk, but I think to both of them, in a sense, is will there still be a future for the professions in the more classical sense? For example, the professional bodies, and what is the role of professional bodies in future, if there is any to them? I think they will have to reshape, to reform. I think many professional bodies have become fairly ineffective. We've also seen a lot of professional scandals in recent years, right? And that have shown the limits of these professional organizations. But at the same time,
you mentioned the example of an accountant taking a consultant role.
Yeah, I mean, that is an example.
More independent.
We also see that, for example, all the major accounting firms have, and I'm not mentioning anyone in particular, have been involved in major, problematic cases or scandal cases. We've seen accounting firms collapse, but also law firms the same, right? I mean, it is not specific to any one particular profession, and the professional bodies haven't been able to prevent this, right? But we haven't found a good substitute for them either, right? So that is still very much an open question for me.
Yeah. The firm?
I think, just if I can respond quickly to that point, I think that's also where it is creating some tension, because I think you've highlighted well in your discussion that the lines are blurring. And in that blurry set of new dynamics, I think things will develop in a way that is not against a certain blueprint. And in that world, I think you'll have mishaps and you'll have sometimes even scandals. And I think the profession as we know it might not exist in 10 years' time. Professional expertise around tackling complex situations and difficult problems will still remain. But in that regard, I think I don't foresee any things where we were not in alignment, but that is an element that I think collectively we have not figured out so far. Yeah.
The role of professional bodies, in that sense, could it be taken over by firms to a certain degree?
That I would doubt, right? I mean, I don't think firms have been particularly effective in this respect either, right? I mean, you mentioned that I used to work with McKinsey, you know, you're working with Bain, and have experience in other professional service firms too. You know, if I look at the example of McKinsey, it's certainly a great firm. It's not the first management consulting firm. There were others, Booz Allen Hamilton, for example, before that, and so on. Nevertheless, you know, it's a firm that has shaped management consulting, to stay with that example. But still, you know, there's a shadow of doubt on this firm, like on many other firms as well, right? If I look at the role of McKinsey within the Enron scandal, for example, and many of you will not remember this, or people in the audience, but it's only about
some of the 1999 graduates might remember.
Right? So, I mean,
It's
this
that
is
era?
just one example, right? And there are many, many others like that.
No, I absolutely fully agree. I have an element where and it's something that I've tried to highlight in the beginning, is digital trust and trust through algorithms is something that I believe is playing out in the industry. Will you still, going forward, when you have the age of a young professional going forward, will you trust a third-party body over a trust that will be given through to you by algorithms? And I think that shift has not necessarily something to do with the individual firms in whatever profession that we were to be discussing, but it is an impact for the traditional trust players, whether it's banks or governments or some of the professional bodies.
Ready to be disrupted by innovations such as blockchain?
As a clear example, but I think conceptually, back to the point that I've tried to make in the discussion, without knowing some of these answers, you need to be ready to be able to adapt to the situation as it evolves. Technology and the innovations in that regard go so quickly that we cannot even say in 2 years' time we'll be there or slightly to the left or to the right.
Okay, last question for now. Can we train people at RSM, for instance, to adapt to change? Is that something we can steer up even during their studies?
I think we can help, right? I mean, it's important neither to over nor to underestimate the role that a school like ours can play in this context.
Okay, so what can we do?
Well, as I said, I think, you know, we have our students here for several years, in particular on the undergraduate side, and many of our students even continue with a master's study here. So we have them for 3 or 4 years, and that is, you know, a time of life that is extremely important, obviously, as a turn from their youth, if you will, to become responsible adults. And so I think we have an opportunity here to shape, you know, the expectations of life, to help the understanding, to develop critical knowledge as well. But it's not just a piece of knowledge that we pass on, right? It is a way of interacting with that knowledge as well, right? The interpretive skills that I think Barry and I have mentioned, the interactive skills as well, right? I mean, the thing that you don't do is when you study, you don't study on your own, right? You become part of groups, you interact both socially as well as academically with others. I think that is extremely important.
Nowadays, most of it online, but still interaction with other students, that's the key.
Yeah, that is definitely an important part. But as I said, I think we need to, in future, and we need to become much better at this, also make sure that we have enough offers for people who at a later stage in their lives come back to an academic setting, right, and take short courses or take entire degrees, I think overall the balance of education will shift and will be distributed a little bit more.
Is this an open invitation to your alumnus?
Certainly.
I'd gladly take that up, because if I can make a final point on that, I am worried about the COVID-19 dynamics, as I think we're all generally, but here especially in understanding what it takes to adapt and to apply interpretation to certain situations. I am a big fan of coaching on individual level, understanding what it still takes in the time that you're here at this beautiful school. That if we were to be able to go back to some form of having that coaching's role in the times that are very formative, I think will play a crucial role going forward.
Okay, that's the first cluster of questions coming in about our resilience to change. You've covered that broadly. Then there's the other set of questions coming in about the definition of well-being. Can we get that up on the screen again? Because on a more zoomed out level, we had a previous question on well-being. If technology succeeds in providing us with actual interactions, yes, we can. Do you think that these macroeconomic trends that I think mostly Barry sketched out will lead to define a new conception of well-being? And if yes, how will it be?
The answer,
to end with an easy question.
So I would say, if I can go first, the answer to the first question is a lot more easier than the answer to the second question. I think, will it lead to a new conception of well-being? I think yes. And I think it'll involve far more factors than we historically have taken into consideration. We've talked about the moral and ethics grounds that you need to take into consideration. Understanding how you can use technology in the broadest sense to also deal with the inequality in the world. Now, what it will look like, I think, is exactly the core of my discussion. I don't know. I don't have that answer. What I need everybody in the profession to be is to be ready for a diverse set of answers as we progress to that final answer, which I think is never going to be a target state. It'll be something that will evolve over time.
I mean, one thing that I do observe is that the expectations of our students is definitely changing, right? I mean, in the past, much more students who were looking for a linear kind of career track to move out of their course of studies, out of their programs, straight into investment banking or consulting or whatever it might be, and
becoming a senior consultant.
And that's still what some people do, and that's great. But I also see far more students who say, well, I really want to make a contribution to the world around me in one way or another, potentially set up on my own, or together with other colleagues. I want to create or help to generate some meaning, right? And they're not in there just for the money, but they're looking for a much more holistic perspective as well, in terms of their careers, in terms of their own development. And they're asking very, very hard questions about that to us as well.
Yeah, one example of such a question might be?
Well, I mean, so for example, is personal utility the only thing that we should be looking for, right, in the choice of our jobs?
Yeah,
right?
The assumption of the homo economicus in these courses, yes. Yeah. Interesting thoughts. Is there anything you would leave the participants in this event with? One personal message, one appeal, something that you've learned over the course of these years? Maybe over the course of this session even?
Well, I mean, for me, one thing is, I'm a very optimistic person overall. Although I do believe there's a lot of change coming, and we definitely live in this VUCA world, there are lots of opportunities as well to be taken advantage of. And I do believe that also educational institutions have a role to play in this context. So if the rector or the president calls me tonight, I think overall my conclusion that I'm drawing is a positive one. That is certainly
So
an
there is no
insightful
demise
state.
of professions.
Well, I think there might be a demise of the professions as we currently know them, right? Or fundamental change, right? The professions will look differently. I don't know exactly how they will look, right? But there will still be a role to play for professional knowledge and expertise combined with these other interpretive and interactive skills that we've been talking about tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Dean Ansgar Richter.
Thank you. I would say that in a world where there's so many layers of complexity, as we, I think, have discussed over the last couple of minutes, it is really, really important to, for yourself, show vulnerability, that you cannot have all the answers. So in a world, and it almost feels like a bit of a tension where it's so much driven by technology, it's so much driven by innovation. I think the world needs to become far more personal in understanding, but I don't have these answers. So if you apply a vulnerable attitude and you go back to interpersonal discussions around coaching and moving further through these, what I've referred to as these waves of change, I think then you'll be able to weather storms and grab the opportunities that are clearly there. I have said to many people, I don't necessarily envy my young children because they will go through massive complexity.
9 and 10 years old?
9 years and 10 years old. But I'm also a little bit jealous because they have a world of opportunity in front of them. And I think that is great to have as an overall context.
Yeah, living in times of COVID, maybe even more VUCA world than it even used to be. Thank you very much, Barry Diepeveen. And thanks to both speakers indeed, and thank you participants. After having discussed future uncertainties for work and business, now you may be asking yourself, what can I do? Well, one example. To ensure the most talented and deserving students are able to come to RSM and fulfill their potential, scholarships are essential. If you're watching this as a student, as a poor student, obviously, we cannot expect you to do anything about that. But if you're an alumna, or another professional, you might be interested in RSM's work and you might consider making a donation to support these scholarships. The link on the screen enables you to donate, make a donation to these scholarships, and all donations together directly fund a student in the next academic year. And in doing so, you also support people in pursuing their profession or maybe semi-profession. Who knows? Thank you very much. Stay healthy and stay safe, and stay with us for the next open lectures. Over the course of the couple of months, we have open lectures about AI, employment and sustainable finance coming up. Thank you very much for tonight. My name is Rick van der Klei. My guests were Professor Ansgar Richter and Barry Diepeveen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.